Now I would like to ask all the speakers of the first session to come here for a round table. If everyone is here, please. And now I hope the audience already collected interesting questions and remarks that can be raised now.
Should I moderate this? Should I moderate? Of course. No. Yeah. All right. So we were thinking that maybe we can, the way we can organize this is to both try and maybe have a conversation amongst the speakers, but also certainly finally let the audience have their word, so that if there are any commentaries, questions, be it to individual speakers or maybe to several of them at the same time, now would be the time for you to ask them. I know there's always some barrier when it comes to asking questions out of a big audience, but it would be great if some of you maybe had questions or comments that could lead to a discussion here. Beata? You can have 3. But maybe is it audible in the back what Beata is saying? So I think you need a microphone.
Possibly. So the first question, or maybe a comment, is to Jasna's talk, and then when I formulate the question, it actually also meant to Emese, or rather the practices of the art pool. And the second one is going to be a 2-part question to Lina. So Sonia was talking about some crucial questions related to the reliability of digitized global archives, and you also listed the Atlas project among the early digitizing undertakings, and I also think that they are a very groundbreaking initiative, and at the same time it's indeed somehow an embarrassing example of how their initiators are often unaware of the exact same gaps that you were talking about, how material might not be accessible from less well documented areas of the world, and then this unawareness was exposed at a conference which was called Global Art Challenges, which means that there were participants beyond European centers of art, and also I have my students, again, an international group, read texts on this initiative, and they were also very sensitive about this lack. So I totally can go with your call for art historians to say that, okay, let's make these materials or accessible, and let's fill this gap. And then this is the question that you also showed that in your institution museum, this is already an ongoing process, and we also know that this is also an ongoing process in Artpool. And the question is that what are your ways to make this material not only accessible, because the internet gives this possibility, but how can you make it, how can you actively distribute it? How can you make it actively, how can you be active in the process of making it visible and accessible? Maybe, I don't know, to link it to broader, well-accessible databases like ArtNet that you mentioned, or what are other ways to, like I say, actively make it visible and usable, not only accessible? Shall I take the second one, or let's go on? But
okay, no, it's working. Thanks, Beata, for the comment and the question. And yes, well, it's quite a challenging task because there are actually two things. First, that you have to produce enormous amount of very well-structured data. So it actually requires a lot of work of different persons who classify, who edit all those data, and basically to give an overview of an institution or of some larger amount of documents. It's really it's really like an endless job. And the other thing, which is now much easier than back then when we launched the museum website with exhibitions archives. Is also a question of translation. So now it's much easier to integrate automatic translations into the databases than it was still, like it required a lot of controls, but still it also needs, especially if we talk about public institutions and public archives, I'm sorry to say this, but there is a big lack of financial support, like from authorities, and somehow also I think that the importance of events as this one, for example, is also to raise the public concern on the importance of not only, well, of course, of artworks, but also how they get disseminated and how they get mediated and at the end described in a manner that can have sense for both artists and public.
Emese, maybe?
Well, just very shortly. Resources are, of course, a key element here, and Artpool is now a much better situation than it was before. So now we have more human sources and all the rest to work or to expand our digitization processes. So we are working on this now constantly, and we are adjusting this to the museum system in the future, which is a huge task. It's really a horrible task. But if you are interested in details, I think Julia Kleitzer is the most competent person to ask you or to tell you more about this topic.
I mean, if I can be just a bit insistent, I think now you both talked on producing this data. And my question was maybe a next step. If you have strategies how to make it prominent, internationally, globally prominent and visible. Okay, you don't have to stay with this question.
Well, one of the steps was, that I mentioned was translation of it's also producing the data, but then I think the problem that somehow we wanted to enhance in the presentation was actually also the way how the data how the data is produced in museums, traditionally within the context of museum documentation, and how, because the advanced example was actually an example from Art Basel, so from commercial sector, which of course invests a lot, and maybe there's also other strategies. So maybe to look what's Emese doing, in a way.
I just want to mention a program which is part of this COAST project, which means that we are part of data visualization project. So we have now a colleague who's present here now, Flora Barkóczy, who's really involved in this kind of work, and we participated last year in CU's summer school project, which was really focused on this topic. So we started a very similar work or process like Jasna and her team in Zagreb Museum.
I think Carolina, you had a question? Yes.
Okay, I have a quick question and two quick questions. So first one, a question to Zdenka Badovinac about the cryptic content of museum. You mentioned about the cryptic content. So you said something that that the subversive agency of the museum lies in the cracks between non-institutionalized content and institutionalized content. And then I would like to know more about the cracks and non-institutionalized content of museum. And a second question to Lina about the methodology of your research, because maybe naughty question, because asking these guys about the past, it just reinforms stereotypes, we all know them. So what would be another way, I mean, are you planning to approach, or besides of interviewing, complement the methodology of this research with some another tricks which will be necessary to get another content, I suppose. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for the question. I'm sure you remember I was talking last time when we met, you were in Ljubljana, about Marko Sančan's project. He did for one of the exhibitions that I curated. And he came actually with the term cryptic. So he did a project that was kind of critical to the conditions that our Museum of Contemporary Art, Metelkova, was built, financed by the European money and so on. It's a long story, to make it short. So this European funding brought a lot of new things in our world. So it is about the question whether we are still the same national museum as we were before, you know, the European Union and so on. So my answer is no, not at all. We are even not aware what kind of institution we are. There are many things that we can't trace with our institutionalized programs. So what we need kind of crypt where we can make a space for something new. So I mentioned the Rock Weber archive, which is only one of these cryptic, let's say, cryptic programs that has many different layers. One is, of course, to give the space to help the curator, independent curator who did the thing and so on. But more than that, it is a tool how to open the door for the new program in the museum. Lack of money, lack of this and that, we can't go on developing the performing art program and so. So there is a crypt where you can experiment and you can open the critical discussion about it on very, innovative way. So I don't know whether this is helpful, if it makes it more, but it's very complex issue. And I also point to the fact that the artist collection started as a kind of cryptic program because there was no space in the mission of the museum and there was no political will to support it.
Other comments, please. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, just to respond about the methodology, thank you. That's a really good question and crucial one. Two parts to the answer. First, in relation to looking at how collective work is being historicized and written about, my plan is to work through different kinds of texts and work out what names are mentioned and at what point and how the collective work is being spoken about. In terms of interviews, that's very difficult because when interviewing people about their work with this approach in mind, so if you come and explicitly ask about the question of gender, it immediately brings forward certain kinds of answers. So what I have been using in my later interviews, the ones I did last year, are narrative interviews where I just ask one question and don't interfere at all until they've finished speaking. I have been thinking how to work through this from here forward, and what seems to be perhaps the best way to work with interviews is grounded research, which I mean, for those of you who don't use grounded research, it involves coding, a very complex process of coding, and it's used a lot in social sciences, not so much in art. And a number of colleagues have suggested that grounded research would be perhaps the best way, but it's a very, very time-consuming and complex process. So I'm considering whether, effectively the research comes from the ground, so the terminology and the issues come from what the interviewees have said. So that's something I'm considering, but it's quite an undertaking. So I am thinking about all these questions.
Yes, sure. Yeah.
I'd like to have a question to Lina about, talking about, you mentioned Antonia Maiazza, who has done Project Feminist Takes, which kind of rereads specific film productions like of Zhali Mirjani or Makaveyev. And I was just wondering, in that creating that kind of platform or discussion that looks at these really important, significant works, was that something that you also kind of got into consideration, or did anything of that? Because it also was a publication tying to these conversations that you were having.
Yeah, I mean, Tonia presented an early version of that at a conference associated with an exhibition I did in 2016. And it's very specific, as you say, and I think it's very, very important work that she's doing. And it definitely connects with kind of this revisiting of well-known works and moments and kind of thinking about them from a feminist perspective. My personal impetus for this project was simply that I wasn't coming across enough pressuring or questioning of just the very, very simple facts associated with collective practice. So in a way, for me, it's unfinished business emerging from my PhD a few years ago. I don't know if that answers.
Go ahead.
I wanted to ask any of the panelists the extent to which the medium of the archive is still a constraint, and also if there are, when you think about archives, I think the default is towards graphic material, documents, maybe ranging to drawings and photographs, diaries, and so forth, but often straining when you cross certain kinds of medium boundaries to sound archives is a distinct notion, film and video archives, a fairly distinct notion, and not often so much communication between those archives and the archives that are based on text and documents. So I was just curious if you had some observations about that. And I also just wanted to mention a kind of personal anecdote. When I was working at Yale in the 1990s, we discovered in the back of the film center a box of materials from the avant-garde filmmaker Mary Ellen Butte. And it was various sorts of project documents, but also cans of 16mm film, some completed, some various sorts of shots and rushes that she had shot towards uncompleted projects. And when you open these cans, you could smell the vinegar. They were disintegrating. So we took them to the Yale Beinecke archive, and they said, we'll take the papers, but we won't take the film. And we begged them, and finally they said, well, we can't work out the status of the preservation of this film, but we'll put them in cold storage. And I understand now, subsequently, they've collected them. But that was an instance where it was just very clear, this far and no further, and medium was really the dividing line for that.
So I didn't expand on the Longwood Bay exhibition, but that kind of involved a variety of archives. And starting with Brian Hand's recovered film, 16 million video, about the last phase of project in '98. And it also included Fergus Kelly, who's a sound artist, who actually worked a new piece from the 90s sound archives and field recordings. So I guess it was lots of different materials. What I actually mentioned that Project's archive is at the National Library of Ireland. That means that I need to ask for permission each and every paper that I use in any kind of presentation. So I started to work with photocopies that kind of got a bit more relaxed. So I'm not actually fetishizing the original documents, which most of the time is like photocopies with some coffee spots as well. So it's, I think the idea was more to actually access very, very various kind of, how would I say, collections. And also it's a lot in personal collections that you also have to negotiate all the kind of the authorship issues. I can't use some of the photographs of that documents, like 7 years of project's history, because the photographer who was actually paid and commissioned to do them started to describe them as additions, artistic work that he wants money for. which I guess, there are lots of practical issues here in the archive, and it's the Active Archive Slow Institution is a project that I initiated and I do. We don't have any kind of personnel, we don't have any infrastructure for that. So that kind of gives you a lot of different kind of thoughts how to involve people, and not necessarily like focusing on working only with the physical material.
Hi. Part of this case study that we're working on at Tate at the moment is trying to find a way to create an archive for the Tate exchange practice. And it's this type of socially engaged, performative practice that they do with a group of people that they refer to as their associates, and it's very public-facing and public-engaged. But the reason they're having to reevaluate it outside of Tate's institutional archive, but also Tate's collecting archive, is there is a materiality that's coming out of the program, and they're assigning so much value to these objects and these artifacts that are being produced. For example, they have a project coming up that works with the coffee makers at Tate, and I can't remember who the other part of the project is, but they already know that they want to keep one of these bricks that are being made out of coffee grounds. And when we put this idea to the institutional archive, they were like, we can't keep a block of coffee grounds. What do you think? Like, we can't do that. And how many are we going to keep? We can only keep a sample. And it's the same with the Guerrilla Girls material. There is thousands and thousands and thousands of responses from the public, and it comes down to resources and space. But they're so set on trying to archive this idea of this practice that we're having to try and find a way to build a counter-archive within the institutional archive, and it speaks to the idea of institutional gaps. And outside of curatorial, there are departments at Tate that get to do quite radical practices that we don't get to do in the main line. But the archive are quite resistant to it. The institutional archive is quite resistant to it because it doesn't look like what they expect an archive to look like. And then when it gets to things like choreography and those sorts of practices that are coming out of Tate Exchange, it doesn't produce anything physical, so then that becomes even more of a challenge to try and find a space and a way to archive that material as well. So I don't know if that helps or answers your question.
I just wanted to add, it also depends on the period which is covered by the materials that you have in archive. For example, I mentioned new tendencies. So there were like art movements from, it was like art movement from in 60s and 70s. And in archive there are tapes with recordings of the talks, of the conferences, and they are part of our archival collection, and they were digitized and indexed by Maria Gatin, my colleague, and also Darko Fritz, curator who worked on a project with new tendencies. And also, rather recently, on the initiative, my colleague Tihomir Milovac, a big exhibition on history of Croatian video was organized in CERT. It was 15 years ago. And actually, artists who participated in the exhibition were also invited to donate the copies of their work for the archive. So they were not donated to, and we have that database, the collection as well. So. But there is also another section in the museum which collects only audiovisual material on the museum's event. So it is present.
I just wanted to add in relation to returning to a question about how to activate archives, the original question. One example that I've been thinking about is a different project that I was involved with many years ago, which went very much from a DIY sort of very curatorial impulse. It was called the Her Noise Archive, then became institutionalized by becoming acquired by the London College of Communication Special Collections and Archives. And the way that brilliant academics at London College of Communication have activated that is to embed it within an MA module. This is to do with sound-based practice. And what's been happening for probably a decade now, if not more, is that that students on the MA module in sound arts respond to the materials in the archive. And this has gone completely beyond our original remit. It started off an exhibition, then became institutionalized, so to speak. and now has a completely separate life of its own, very much a DIY, very much kind of independent life on YouTube through the responses. So I think perhaps to respond to the question about how to activate archives, one way would be to very simply connect with academic practices and work with specific students and modules that might be interested in accessing the archive. And I think this could be a way to sort of let it have a life of its own, an afterlife.
Ivana?
My question is again for Lina, sorry. I was wondering to what extent you're also interested in Oho or its post-history as a commune, because here you really have a very specific case not only of an art collective, but also of a commune, both of which were supposed to be these liberatory, emancipatory practices, right? And also in the case of the commune, very often for women, something that's supposed to be a liberation, also sexual liberation, turned into another mode of subordination. So that seems very interesting as a very specific case study to me. Also, Žilnik's film, again, is connected because, of course, they're also a kind of commune, and Yugoslava is the only one among them.
Thank you. That's a great question. I mean, it's hugely interesting. What is interesting to me that is that when you merge, sorry, I have to put this down. When you merge art and life, if life is deeply patriarchal, what happens then? How do you then work with that or against that? And that's what I want to continue to research. But yeah, absolutely. That's where it's at in a way.
I think there's a lot more to discuss, but probably all of you are quite hungry, so I think we could head to the downstairs canteen restaurant and maybe continue some discussions informally during lunch, and we should come back in 1 hour's time and continue with the second session. So thanks a lot for all your efforts.